Well, next is David Mcfadden. Now, David works in one of the newest museum buildings in New York City, a place that's full of light and colour, looks out over Columbus Circle and the edge of Central Park. It's the Museum of Arts and Design, essentially a gallery of contemporary work. And David's addressing the question of diversity in our museums, tonight's topic, by talking about the kind of work that's being created today, what I think you call the blur zone, David. Thank you. Sorry, sound guys.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. Living in New York City, we're very much aware that our city and our entire country, like Australia itself, is a land of immigrants from every conceivable cultural group. And as such, we have an enormously interesting responsibility to our audiences, to our constituencies, as we like to think of them. We're blessed being in New York City by one fact, and that is the sheer number of museums that exist. There are just approaching 120 museums in New York City. And because of that number, we have an enormously rich cultural menu of possibilities for any visitor to the city and any resident who brings with them an association with their own cultural group, their own ethnic group. We have the Japan Society, we have the Studio Museum in Harlem, we have the Ukrainian Historical Society, we have Museo El Barrio for all of the Latino and Hispanic artists and constituencies. It does relieve a lot of the pressure because we're not the only act in town. That being said, there are also some issues that we have dealt with that I think are very interesting in terms of how we have given ourselves the responsibility of dealing with the voices in our community, whatever that might be. About 25 years ago or so, I was serving as the president for a group in ICOM, the International Council of Museums, the subgroup devoted to decorative arts and design. And at that point, being new in this position, I suggested that our annual meeting take on the subject of cultural diversity in museums. And interestingly enough, 25 years ago, almost to a person, my colleagues, most of whom were European, said, "Oh, that's not an issue for us. We don't think about those things. I don't think it would be an interesting topic to discuss." And I, of course, have talked to a lot of them over the years, and I'll say it's a different world out there today as people have moved in large numbers into countries that had a great self-assurance about how kind of simple it was to deal with diversity in their own audiences. But that being said, come back to the origin of our museum, which is the newest building in town. Although our museum opened to the public in 1956 as the Museum of Contemporary Craft, it was founded by a visionary woman, Aileen Osborne Webb, who realized that there was an enormous amount of creative work happening in the United States that was not recognized in any cultural institution. Those were the studio crafts practitioners, people making ceramics, glass, wood, metal, fiber, all of the so-called craft mediums, but doing work that was contemporary and fresh and important. There was no place for this whole enormous constituency to be seen. So when Mrs. Webb created the museum, it gave voice to a broad range of practitioners in the arts. And I'll come back to this in my closing remarks, if I can remember. We have an unusual history of serving the audiences that are not always recognized. And the main audience in that regard are the makers, the artists. We would not have a reason to exist if it were not for the artists. And I consider representing the voice of that community of practitioners one of our most important responsibilities. We do it through several interesting strategies that have worked very well. We do a number of thematic and group exhibitions, first of all. We have organized exhibitions that have tackled areas that have not been looked at by other cultural institutions, but from the point of view of art, craft, and design. For example, 10 years ago in 2000, I did the first in a series of 3 exhibitions, the last third of which will conclude next year, called Changing Hands, Art Without Reservation. It was the first survey of what was happening among innovative, non-traditional artists in our own Native American communities. It was an eye-opener for people because they had no idea that that kind of work was taking place. In another month, we will open an exhibition called the Global Africa Project, which looks at Africa and its diaspora across the world. African artists working in Japan, all throughout Europe, people who are in the fields of design, architecture, and craft, but really looking at what being African is really all about. In our work with makers, we had one other very fortunate thing that we can say is true for us and probably not for any other museum in our country. From the very beginning, 1957, when the first object entered the museum, we collected artistic products made by women. It sounds rather simple today, but in the past that was not the case. I just sat on a panel at the Brooklyn Museum. We had 4 museums in New York, including the Museum of Modern Art, and we were talking about how are women represented in your collections. And to a person, they said that the number of women in their collections was a fraction of what the total collection was about. I was very pleased and very proud to do my own count through our computerized database, and we found that there are 48% of the works are by women in our collection. That is an extraordinary, incredible balance because it does not happen in other places. So that's one area, one audience, one constituency that I think we have given voice to in an unusual way. But I come back to the makers and how we deal with this issue of how do you represent the voice of the makers. First of all, artists have to make a living. It is pure and simple. They need income to survive. So we encourage the audience of collectors to take part in our museum. We want to introduce the potential buyer of a work of art to the work of the best artists coming up in the ranks today. That, again, it's a small group, but it's a very powerful voice in shaping the history of how art is going to be viewed in the next couple of decades. Secondly, when we do exhibitions, and certainly I make a very strict effort to maintain it in my own, I always show well-established artists with emerging artists, putting them in the same context at the same level. What it does psychologically is something very interesting. People take all of the artists more seriously when you see that mixture. Artists that would be under-recognized are now fully recognized because, hey, we're in the next gallery. Oh, there's the work by Damien Hirst. Happens to be on view right now. And then we have a work by Maria Cordoza from El Salvador next to the Damien Hirst. Suddenly people look at her work with a little more attention. It's a strategy that is intentional, but it is one that works. But coming back to the overall issue of how do we represent the voices of a diverse culture, because of the fact we are in New York City, we have the opportunity to treat an enormously wide range of interests and tastes. Our museum, looking at the works of people who come out of left field quite often, the people that are under-recognized, I think one of our major audiences and our major triumphs as an institution is giving a voice to that community of artists, and specifically artists that are gender equal in terms of men and women. Thank you.
Thanks, David Mcfadden. We've got 2% to go. Let's now welcome Adrian Franklin. Adrian's tracking the historical shifts in the kinds of things that museums have collected and shown, particularly as national museums developed, and the influence of private amateur collectors. Adrian Franklin.
Thank you, Amanda. Most of you, if you're from Australia anyway, will know me as someone who's unreasonably and probably unfeasibly attached to the modern world, biased in favour of the modern world, and ever ready to give Gordon Brown and any other antique dealer or anything old a pretty bad time, if I possibly can. I tell him that the Georgian furniture he so loves was a form of elitism that only the rich who consumed in the most ostentatious way could afford. Meanwhile, the poor, often those people who were in the industries making those things, were in bad winters burning the wood, the tables, the architraves. I mean, I did a PhD where I looked at the condition of the English working classes in the Georgian period and into the 19th century. And very often the enumerators found no furniture at all, and they often found what wood, the banisters, the floorboards missing because these people burnt them to keep themselves warm. I give him a bad time about the rare woods that they used, the ivory that they so loved, the bone this, the bone that, all the animals that died for this great aesthetic. But in truth, his preferred world of Georgian exclusivity and the modern world are both focused on a kind of singularity, a cultural standardization. The Georgians who consumed antiques had regard only for themselves. They couldn't care less about the indigenous people they were robbing of their forests and animals, or indeed the working class who they exploited to keep them in the position that they had become accustomed. But in the same way, the modern world, in its unswerving pursuit of human perfection, progress, democratization, in a most well-meaning way, disregarded the past and had eyes only for the future, for the perfectible modern. And so it could disregard things that happened in the past, other cultures that it deemed backward. It so easily destroyed all of the Georgian housing that is now so loved in the British cities. In order to build high-rise blocks, they said they were badly built, jerry-built, they were leaky, they were hard, they were inefficient, and of course they were. But the thing about the modern world in its period up until about the 1970s was it was an intolerant world. It wanted to see a new future. It was involved in progress. But it was also involved in forgetting the past and forgetting other people who weren't part of that modern project. Of course, it wanted them to be healthier, to live in better housing, better heated housing. It wanted them to be educated, to have hospitals. But most important of all, it wanted them to have lovely, beautiful, well-designed objects. The industrial design movement at the beginning of the 20th century, which I champion and love against Gordon's antiques, wanted everybody to have an aesthetic life. And they succeeded. Because look, here we all are in a beautiful palace, and it's free to everybody, I think, tonight. Having said that I'm unreasonably biased in the modern world, towards the modern world, and I am, and I make no apologies about it. It's a much better world than the Georgian world. It's not that I don't know a lot about the past, and in fact, I have to admit, the thing that I'm collecting at the moment has to do with my own discovered ethnic background. Well, it's not really much of a discovery. I've known it for a while, but I got interested in it because I probably descend from what before the Roman occupation of Britain was called the Cantiaci. It was a kingdom. It's now called Kent. Our capital city is Canterbury, and the county is called Kent. And those words come down from these pre-Roman people that I, in all probability, descend from, because there's landed people on both sides of my family, and they're not Normans and they're not Romans. I got interested in them because I watched Time Team. And Time Team's a really good TV program, and if you're in TV, you have to watch Top Gear and Time Team, because they're the two best TV programs. You learn a lot. But what I learned was that even 1,000 years before the Romans came to Britain, Europe was a very tiny place. Most European people, there was great ethnic diversity, but they exchanged very freely and extensively. So in pre-Roman Britain, there were things from every major pottery in Europe. We find examples of it. We find jewels and stones from as far away as India. We find coins from Greece in circulation in 200 BC in the UK. We found the tribal leaders of the Cantiaci actually sent their children to Rome to be educated before the Roman invasion. And we find things like Pontius Pilate, who I always thought of as this exotic, almost sort of, sacred, mythological person from time. He was actually educated in Scotland. And when the Romans came to Britain, they brought this mixing and hybridization. The Roman army had people from everywhere. They were moved around the Roman Empire, and goods and technologies moved around. It became a world in which the collector was almost an impossible person, because the collector is the person that needs to assemble things for some reason, because they're rare, because they're exotic, because they're new, or they're from the past, and they've been discovered. But this world that was latent and apparent to everyone didn't require the collector. It was there, and it was all around them. And you find that there were hoards of treasure, and there were collections of war booty, the spoils of war. But there weren't many collections other than libraries and a few other things like that. There weren't many collectors. And the collectors didn't appear until Europe broke out of Europe in the 16th century particularly, and started to discover these exotic things, these strange, amazing things, the constant supply of new exotic things being imported into Europe, first of all into the courts. The dukes, the kings, they set up their Wunderkabinet, they set up their zoological gardens, their menageries, their botanic gardens. There were collectors all over the world sending it back. And there was this thirst for new things that weren't European, that weren't everyday things. And for a while, when those collections went through a stage of being spectacles that ordinary people wanted to go and sneak in and see, to the point where the first museums and zoological collections started to emerge, this great global diversity was all the rage. But very soon after that, the museums started to celebrate something quite different. They had this scientific and educational remit, and that kind of melted all of that diversity and celebration down into a kind of form of high culture, in which popular culture and indigenous cultures and everyday cultures were left to one side. And you start to see a lot of the museums favouring the rare, the exotic, the high-end technology, the great artists, the great craftspeople. And you don't see examples of great everyday life. I mean, the Victoria and Albert Museum has hardly any popular culture in it at all. And that, for me, is the archetype. The 1970s was something of a tipping point, a watershed, because alongside these high art, high culture orientated national museums and even regional museums, modernity was busy burying popular culture in the past as fast as it could. I mean, when I was young, I was watching hundreds and thousands of thatched cottages from every single age, all the way back to the 10th, 14th century, Georgian working class housing being bulldozed. I saw the whole lot go. And it was only when they started to hit Art Deco, the 30s and 20s building, that I banged the table and said, enough. But you see, I hadn't had that idea myself, because that would have been around 1975 to 79 I had that thought. But before then, ordinary people had seen the modern world wipe away the material culture of their childhoods, their adolescence, their early adulthood, their family times, in favour of the constantly new, the new that always replaces the present and the past. And they got sick of it. They saw steam engines. This was the first moment, apparently, of the heritage turn. They saw steam engines, guys that used to work on them, guys who were boys and girls who were around when they were working, and they saw them dying, rusting in fields and barns, and they said, could we live with ourselves in a world without a steam engine, without steam traction engines, steam rollers, all that noise, that smell, the railways? Is that really are we going to let that go? And they said, hey, we don't have to. We just don't have to. We can use our skills. We can do that. We can get a traction engine working, and we can start a club, and we can get several. We can have a steam rally, and we'll see what the people think of that. And they were an enormous success, and they inspired a limitless number of others to do the same with almost anything. I mean, the last person to come up to me with this, inspired, road to Damascus idea was someone who'd thought of, corrugated iron, the tin roofs of every Australian barn and house, as being, in danger of being lost. They were actually dying and rusting. Someone's got to save Australia's tin roofs. And I went round to their place, and it's an amazing thing to see. And it's an aesthetic thing. It's so fabulous. It morphed into something which deindustrialization propelled to something that we all take for granted now, which is a kind of heritage industry. All around Britain, when industries died, they wanted to replace industry with something, and they usually did it with tourism. So instead of there being a working mine, suddenly there was a mining museum, and everything to do with mines became available. So there's working class popular culture became something that was fascinating and could be rediscovered. And so on and so forth. The potteries, the heritage from different migrant people, the war, the two wars. I mean, there was just no end to it. And the thing is, when you ask yourself, well, why are people doing this? Why do people become collectors? And I think the balance of this rescuing of popular culture and other cultures from the oblivion that is bound to come its way from the modern impulse. When you ask why people do it, the answer is really very simple, and that is that collecting is a form of memory. It is our way of remembering the past. And because we are so locked in, our own selves, our own identities are so locked into the objects and the cultures in which we grew up, in which we grew our children, in which our grandparents lived, in which our ancestors lived. I mean, because, one of the reasons I'm into Iron Age Cantiaci coins is because I have this strong feeling suddenly that I want to know about these objects. I want to know who these people were, these people who covered themselves in blue and faced the Romans across the Channel. And while I'm bagging Gordon Brown, I just want to say it wasn't the Scots who did that, as some of the films, the scurrilous films about the noble Scots would have it. It was the Cantiaci who put woad on their face and faced their enemies. So it's about memory, and it's also about tolerance, because I think as much as we want to remember ourselves, and as much as private collectors have really led the way and shamed the national institutions, who are catching up now, it has to be said, it is against intolerance, okay, and it's against being forgotten that I think the collecting impulse meets the world in which we want, and asks the question, how can museums reflect cultural diversity? Because the fact is, we're asking that question now as if that's important, but it hasn't been important all the time. It's important now. It's become an important agenda. So there you are. There are a few of my thoughts about this cultural diversity. But I think we're through the worst. I think we now naturally are curious about other people's cultures, just as much as we bang the table and demand that our own are never forgotten. Thank you very much.